Linda, and this is Coffee and Crime. This podcast explores real cases involving violence, loss, and the darker side of human nature. Some details may be confronting. Listener discretion is strongly advised.
On a quiet suburban street in Sydney's southwest, there lived a man many people thought they knew. He went to work, he came home, he lived a relatively ordinary life. He was a neighbour, a husband, a father, someone people would see in passing and never think twice about. For years, Ivan Milat existed in the background of everyday life, until the day his name became attached to one of the darkest criminal cases in Australian history. The world would come to know him as the man responsible for the Belanglo backpacker murders, a man convicted of killing 7 young travellers whose journeys ended in a remote forest in New South Wales. But before the headlines, before the investigation, and before the courtroom, there was a childhood, a family, a man who spent decades building a life that from the outside appeared completely normal. And perhaps that's what makes this story of Ivan Milat so unsettling. Because the most disturbing part was not that he looked like a monster. It was that, to many people around him, he didn't. This is the story of Ivan Milat, the man behind Belanglo. Ivan Robert Marco Milat was born on December 27, 1944 in Guildford, New South Wales. His parents were Croatian immigrants who built a life for their family in Australia. And like many migrant families of that generation, they arrived looking for stability, opportunity, and a better future for their children. The Milat household was not small. Ivan was one of 14 children, 14 personalities, 14 lives under one roof. A crowded home where privacy was limited and everyone was expected to contribute. His father worked hard to provide for the family, and his mother raised the children. The family lived a modest life, and the children grew up understanding responsibility from a young age, helping around the home, looking after younger siblings, doing their part. Growing up in a large family can shape people in different ways. Some children become independent. Some become protective. Some learn to compete for attention. Those who later studied Ivan Milat's life often looked at his childhood for clues. Not because his upbringing explained what happened later. It didn't. Millions of people grow up in difficult circumstances and never commit serious crimes. But because understanding someone's background helps us understand the person that they became. Descriptions of Ivan as a child and a young man vary. Some people remembered him as quiet. Others describe him as someone with a strong personality. He was not someone who immediately stood out as dangerous. There was no clear moment when people looked back and said, that was the moment we knew. Life is really that simple. Instead, The picture that emerged over time was of someone who could present different of himself depending on who was watching. To some people, he was polite. To others, he could be intimidating. To some, he was helpful. And to others, he could be stubborn and confrontational. And that contrast would follow him throughout his entire life. As an adult, Ivan Milat built the kind of life that appeared ordinary. He found employment, he married, he had children, he bought a home, and he became part of a community. He worked for local government as a road maintenance worker, a job that meant spending time outdoors and travelling through different parts of New South Wales. It was steady work, routine work, the type of job many people would consider completely unremarkable. He was familiar with the roads and isolated areas around Sydney and regional New South Wales. That knowledge would later become significant to investigators. But before anyone suspected him of murder, Ivan Milat was simply another person going about his life. Neighbours would later describe their shock when police arrived at his home, because the person they saw on the news didn't match the person they thought they knew. The man accused of some of Australia's most horrific crimes was not a stranger. He was someone who had been living among them. After Ivan Milat was arrested, investigators began looking back through his past, trying to understand whether there had been signs, whether there had been moments that suggested a darker side. Years before Belanglo, Milat had already come to police attention. In 1971, Milat was charged over allegations involving 2 female hitchhikers, including robbery and assault. The charges did not result in a conviction, but the incident was later revisited by investigators examining his history. Decades later, the allegation became part of a broader discussion around his life, because the circumstances were difficult to ignore. 2 female travellers, a roadside encounter, a weapon, a situation that years later would appear disturbingly similar to the case he would eventually be convicted for. There were also other reports over the years involving disputes and allegations about his behaviour, conflicts with others, arguments, incidences where people describe him as aggressive and controlling. But it's more important to remember a troubling history is not proof of later crimes. A person's past can raise questions, but questions are not answers. For years, Ivan Milat continued living his life. He worked, spent time with his family, and moved through the community unnoticed by most people, until a series of disappearances changed everything. During the late 1980s and early 90s, Australia was a popular destination for young travellers. But for some, that journey would end in tragedy. Travellers began disappearing. At first, the cases seemed separate. Different people, different locations, and different circumstances. Then police discovered something that would change everything, deep inside Belanglo State Forest. A place that had been almost unknown to most Australians was about to become forever associated with one of the country's most notorious crimes. 7 young backpackers had been found brutally murdered. The search for answers had begun, and eventually, investigators would find their way to Ivan Milat. The investigation was enormous. Years later, when the Belanglo murders became national news, a man named Paul watched reports about the investigation. Paul had managed to survive a terrifying encounter with a man while he was backpacking around Australia. An encounter he would never forget. Then he saw a photograph, a face that he recognised immediately. The man in the news report was the same man Paul said had attacked him years earlier, Ivan Milat. Paul contacted the police, and his identification gave investigators something that they hadn't had before: a connection between Milat and an earlier attack involving a young traveller. But the evidence was not without challenge. The defence would later argue that years had passed, that memories could change, that even honest witnesses could make mistakes. The prosecution argued that Paul's memory was different. He wasn't remembering an ordinary meeting. He was remembering a moment where he believed he was going to die. And that memory would become one of the most important pieces of the case against Ivan Milat. As investigators continued building their case, they began focusing on Ivan Milat. He lived in Eagle Vale. He was not someone most people would immediately suspect. But investigators believed there were connections. His knowledge of the isolated roads, his history involving hitchhikers, the identification from Paul Onions, and evidence they believed linked him to the victims. Police now had their suspect, but they needed to prove it. On the 22nd of May 1994, police arrived at Ivan Milat's home. The quiet suburban street suddenly became the centre of an international investigation. Neighbours watched as detectives entered the property. A place that had always appeared ordinary was now surrounded by police. Milat was arrested without incident. There was no dramatic confrontation, no escape, no confession. The man police believed was responsible for 7 murders was now in custody. But an arrest was only the beginning, because the question remained, could police prove it? After the arrest, investigators searched properties connected to Ivan Milat. They examined his home, his vehicles, and his belongings. Police recovered items including firearms, ammunitions, camping equipment, knives, and clothing. To investigators, these items were significant, but they knew something important. A suspicious item is not automatically proof. A firearm can belong to a lawful owner. Camping equipment can belong to someone who enjoys the outdoors. And a vehicle can collect innocent traces every day. The challenge was showing that these items were connected to the crimes. On the 26th of March 1996, Ivan Milat's trial began in the Supreme Court of New South Wales. It would become one of the most closely watched trials in Australian history. The prosecution argued that Milat had targeted young travellers, people who were vulnerable, people who trusted strangers, people who were far away from home. They presented evidence they believed showed a pattern of opportunity, control, and violence. The defence argued something very different. They said the case was based on suspicion, and they questioned the evidence. They challenged witnesses. They argued that individual pieces of the case could have innocent explanations. The jury had to decide. Was Ivan Milat simply a man surrounded by coincidence? Or had police uncovered the person responsible for the 7 murders? After months of evidence, the jury reached their decision. On the 27th of July 1996, Ivan Milat was found guilty. 7 counts of murder. The victims were Caroline Clark, Joanne Walters, Deborah Everest, James Gibson, Simone Schmidl, Anya Habschied, and Gabor Neugebauer. For Australia, the case had reached its legal conclusion. But for Ivan Milat, the story was far from over. Because behind prison walls, he would spend the next 23 years maintaining one thing: he was innocent. For Ivan Milat, the courtroom was not the end of the story. Because for the rest of his life, he would continue to insist that he had been wrongly convicted. After his conviction, Ivan Milat was transferred to Goulburn Correctional Centre, where he would spend the remainder of his life. The man who once moved freely through Sydney's suburbs was now living under constant supervision. His days were controlled by prison routines. His movements were restricted. His contact with the outside world was limited. But even behind prison walls, Ivan Milat remained a person of fascination. People wanted to understand him. How could someone who appeared ordinary to neighbours and workmates become connected to one of Australia's darkest crimes? Someone who interacted with him in prison described him as someone who enjoyed attention, someone who liked discussing his case, someone who continued to argue his innocence. Others describe him as difficult and unwilling to accept responsibility, a man who showed little remorse. As with much of Ivan's life, people saw different versions of him. Some saw a convicted killer refusing to admit what he had done. Others saw a man who genuinely believed that the justice system had failed him. He argued that the evidence against him had been misunderstood. He questioned the investigation. Over the years, he continued attempting to challenge his conviction. He made appeals, he sought legal reviews, and he continued pushing the claim that he had been wrongly imprisoned. But every challenge failed. His conviction remained. The courts had reached their decision, but outside the courtroom, debate continued. One of the most controversial theories surrounding Ivan Milat is the belief held by some that he was framed. It's a theory that has circulated for years, online, in documentaries, and among people who question the official version of events. Those who believe Milat was framed often point to several things. They point out that there was no confession because Milat never admitted to the crimes. They point out there was no eyewitness who saw the murders take place. Nobody watched the killings happen. They argue that much of the prosecution's case relied on circumstantial evidence that required the jury to look at many different pieces and decide whether they created one clear picture. Some also question whether police became too focused on Milat once he became the main suspect. They suggest investigators may have stopped looking as closely at other possibilities. And these questions are why the theory continues to attract attention. But then there's the other side. The conviction was not based on one single piece of evidence. The prosecution presented a combination of evidence. The identification by Paul Onions, evidence recovered during the police searches, and items connected to the victims. The circumstances surrounding the murders and the patterns investigators said linked the crimes together. The defence challenged that evidence during the trial. The jury heard both sides, and after months of testimony, they found Ivan Milat guilty. There is no credible evidence that Ivan Milat was framed, and no alternative offender has been identified. And legally, Ivan Milat remains responsible for the crimes. But the fact that people still debate the case decades later shows just how much fascination surrounds it. Perhaps the biggest unanswered question surrounding Ivan Milat is whether Belanglo was the full story. Almost immediately after his arrest, rumours began. 7 victims had been discovered, but some people wondered whether there could have been more. The reason the speculation continued was because of the circumstances. Before Belanglo, there had been other missing travellers, other disappearances, other cases where families never received the answers they wanted. And over the years, Ivan Milat was linked through speculation to other unsolved crimes. Some people believed he may have been responsible for additional crimes, and some suggested the true number of victims may never be known. But speculation is not proof. Despite years of rumours and investigation, no additional murders have ever been proven against Ivan Milat. The only confirmed convictions remain: the 7 Belanglo murders and the attack on Paul Onions. But the rumours persisted because of one uncomfortable reality. Ivan Milat never explained anything. If there were more victims, he never named them. If there were more crimes, he never admitted them. If there were secrets hidden somewhere, he took them with him. In 2017, he attracted further attention after beginning a hunger strike while in prison. He was demanding access to a computer so he could work on legal documents connected to his ongoing attempts to challenge his conviction. As the years passed, Ivan Milat's health began to decline. In 2019, Ivan Milat was diagnosed with esophageal cancer. His final years were spent dealing with worsening health while still maintaining his innocence. Even near the end of his life, there was no confession, no explanation, and no final revelation. Another disturbing detail from Ivan Milat's time in prison was an incident in which he had severed one of his own fingers. While imprisoned at Goulburn Correctional Centre, Milat cut off the little finger of his left hand using a plastic knife, and he attempted to send it to the New South Wales Supreme Court as part of his ongoing fight to have his conviction reviewed. The act shocked prison officials and attracted widespread media attention, becoming another example of the extreme lengths Milat was willing to go in his continued claims that he had been wrongly convicted. This was not the first time Milat had injured himself while in prison. In the past, he swallowed razor blades, staples, and other metal objects. On the 27th of October 2019, Ivan Milat died in prison at the age of 74. He died as he had lived for more than 2 decades after his conviction, maintaining his innocence. The man who had become one of Australia's most infamous criminals took his version of events with him. But the victims remained. When people talk about Ivan Milat, it's easy for the story to become focused on him, his names, his actions, his mystery. But at the centre of this case were 7 people who had their futures taken away. They were not just victims in a criminal case. They were sons, daughters, partners, friends, people who were loved. The Ivan Milat case changed Australia. It changed how people thought about travelling alone. And it left a permanent mark on the country's history. But perhaps the most haunting part of the case is the contrast. A man who appeared ordinary. A crime that was anything but. Ivan Milat spent decades living a normal life before becoming one of Australia's most infamous prisoners. And decades after his conviction, people still ask the same questions. Were there more victims? Did anyone know more than they admitted? Were all of the answers uncovered? The courts reached their conclusion. The jury reached their verdict. But the questions surrounding Ivan Milat remain part of one of Australia's darkest criminal histories. Because in the end, this case is not remembered because of the man who became famous. It is remembered because of the people whose lives were lost. This was the story of Ivan Milat, the man behind Belanglo.
Not every case finds closure. Not every question gets answered. And sometimes the truth stays buried long after the headlines fade. This has been Coffee and Crime AU. For deeper into the case, visit Coffee and Crime AU online. Until next time.